Hello? Hello? Hi! Hi, everybody! Hold on. I'm just gonna fix something. Hello? Alright. Hi, everybody! Welcome to my channel again. This is Kaiko. And welcome to another Tall Tales with Kaiko. Hi, Uzix! Welcome to the chat! It's really nice it's really nice to see you again. So, today we are gonna tell the story of Sinbad. Uzix requested this in the last episode of Tall Tales with Kaiko. So, I got a copy of the story here for you. And I'm really excited to tell it. It's a bit long though, so you better grab a glass of water, some popcorn, or whatever food you desire, so you know you could relax a bit while we go and talk. Alright, okay, so shall we get started? Okay, hold on, I will just grab the book we have here. Really? Oh, that's really nice of you. Thank you. Yeah, I think this is a really good segment of Mondays that I like because you know it really is relaxing. Again, for anybody else who is listening, Tall Tales with Kaika is a segment that I've prepared for all of you so that on Mondays we can just take our time and relax, you know, because Mondays are a bit more busy, a bit more stressful, and at the end of the day, we just want to relax, right? We just want to chill, maybe read a good book, grab a hot cup of joe, or maybe some hot cocoa, you know, and relax. Okay, so the story of Sinbad the Voyager. In the reign of the Caliph Harun al-Rashid, there lived at Baghdad a poor porter called Hindbad. One day, when the weather was excessively hot, he was employed to carry a heavy burden from one end of the town to the other. Having still a great way to go, he came into a street where a refreshing breeze blew on his face, and the pavement was sprinkled with rose water. As he could not desire a better place to rest, he took off his load and sat upon it near a large mansion. He was much pleased that he stopped at this place, for the agreeable smell of wood of aloes and of pastils that came from the house, mixing with the scent of the rose water, completely perfumed the air. Besides, he heard from within a concert of instrumental music, accompanied with the harmonious notes of nightingales. This charming melody and the smell of savory dishes made the porter conclude there was a feast within. His business seldom leading him that way, he knew not to whom the mansion belonged. But to satisfy his curiosity, he went to some of the servants, whom he saw standing at the gate in magnificent apparel, and asked the name of the proprietor. "How," replied one of them, "do you live in Baghdad, and know not of that this is the house of Sinbad the sailor, the famous voyager who has sailed round the world?" The porter, who had heard of the Sinbad's riches, lifted up his eyes to heaven and said, loud enough to be heard, "Almighty Creator of all things, consider the differences between Sinbad and me. I am every day exposed to fatigues and calamities, and can scarcely get barley bread for myself and my family, whilst happy Sinbad expends immense riches and leads a life of pleasure. What has he done to obtain a lot so agreeable? And what have I done to deserve one so wretched?" Whilst the porter was thus indulging his melancholy, a servant came out of the house, and taking him by the arm, bade him follow him, for Sinbad his master wanted to speak to him. The servants brought him into a great hall, where a number of people sat around a table covered with all sorts of savory dishes. At the upper end sat a venerable gentleman, with a long white beard, and behind him stood a number of officers and domestics, all ready to attend his pleasure. This personage was Sinbad. The porter, whose fear was increased at the sight of so many people and of a banquet so sumptuous, saluted the company, trembling. Sinbad bade him draw near, and seating him at his right hand, served him himself, and gave him a cup of excellent wine. When the repast was over, Sinbad addressed his conversation to Hindbad, and inquired his name and employment. "My lord," answered he, "my name is Hindbad." "I am very glad to see you," replied Sinbad, "but I wish to hear from your own mouth what it was you lately said in the street." Sinbad had himself heard the porter complain through the window, and this it was that induced him to have him brought in. At this request, Hindbad hung his head down in confusion and replied, "My lord, I confess that my fatigue put me out of humor and occasioned me to utter some indiscreet words, which I beg you to pardon." "Do not think I am so unjust," resumed Sinbad, "as to resent such a complaint. But I must rectify your error concerning myself. You think, no doubt, that I have acquired without labor and trouble the ease which I now enjoy. But do not mistake. I did not attain to this happy condition without enduring for several years more trouble of body and mind than can well be imagined. Yes, gentlemen," he added, speaking to the whole company, "I can assure you my troubles were so extraordinary that they were calculated to discourage the most covetous from undertaking such voyages as I did to acquire riches. Perhaps you have never heard a distinct account of my wonderful adventures, and since I have this opportunity, I will give you a faithful account of them, not doubting but it will be acceptable. Water break. We are entering the first voyage. Okay. The first voyage. I inherited from my father considerable property, the greater part of which I squandered in my youth in dissipation. But I perceived my error, and reflected that riches were perishable, and quickly consumed by such ill managers as myself. I further considered that by my irregular way of living I wretchedly misspent my time, which is, of all things, the most valuable. Struck with these reflections, I collected the remains of my fortune, and sold all my effects by public auction. I then entered into a contract with some merchants, who traded by sea. hold on. Sorry, somebody texted me. Okay, back to the story. Struck with these reflections, I collected the remains of my fortune and sold all my effects by public auction. I then entered into a contract with some merchants, who traded by sea. I took the advice of such as I thought most capable, and resolving to improve what money I had, I embarked with several merchants on board a ship, which we had jointly fitted out. We set sail and steered our course toward the Indies through the Persian Gulf, which is formed by the coasts of Arabia Felix on the right, and by those of Persia on the left. At first I was troubled with seasickness, but speedily recovered my health, and was not afterwards subject to that much complaint. In our voyage, we touched at several islands, where we sold or exchanged our goods. One day, whilst under sail, we were becalmed near a small island, but little elevated above the level of the water, and resembling a green meadow. The captain ordered his sails to be furled, and permitted such persons as were so inclined to land, of which I was one. Number I was one. That's an interesting way of saying it. But while we were enjoying ourselves in eating and drinking, and recovering ourselves from the fatigue of the sea, the island on a sudden trembled, and shook us terribly. The motion was perceived on board the ship, and we were called upon to re-embark speedily, or we should all be lost, for what we took for an island proved to be the back of a sea monster. The nimblest got into the sloop, others betook themselves to swimming, but for myself I was still upon the back of the creature when he dived into the sea, and I had time only to catch hold of a piece of wood that we had brought out of the ship. Meanwhile, the captain, having received those on board who were in the sloop, and taken up some of those that swam, resolved to improve the favourable gale that had just risen, and hoisting his sails, pursued his voyage, so that it was impossible for me to recover the ship. Thus was I exposed to the mercy of the waves all the rest of the day and the following night. By this time I found my strength gone, and despaired of saving my life, when happily a wave threw me against an island. The bank was high and rugged, so that I could scarcely have got up, had it not been for some roots of trees, which chance placed within reach. Having gained the land, I lay down upon the ground half dead, until the sun appeared. Then, though I was very feeble, both from hard labour and want of food, I crept along to find some herbs fit to eat, and had the good luck not only to procure some, but likewise to discover a spring of excellent water, which contributed much to recover me. Hi, Space Panini! Welcome to the chat! We are reading Sinbad and the Seven Seas. I hope you enjoy! After this, I advanced farther into the island, and at last reached a fine plain, where at a great distance I perceived some horses feeding. I went toward them, and as I approached heard the voice of a man, who immediately appeared and asked me who I was. I related to him my adventure, after which, taking me by the hand, he led me into a cave, where there were several other people no less amazed to see me than I was to see them. I partook of some provisions which they offered me. I then asked them what they did in such a desert place, to which they answered that they were grooms belonging to the Maharaja, sovereign of the island, and that every year at the same season they brought thither the king's horses for pasturage. Hi, Therese! Welcome to the chat as well! Hi, hello, hello! We're reading, I will say it again, we're reading Sinbad and the Seven Seas. Hope you enjoy the rest of the story. They added that they were to return home on the morrow, and had I been 1 day later, I must have perished, because the inhabited part of the island was at a great distance, but it would have been impossible for me to have got thither without a guide. Next morning they returned to the capital of the island, took me with them, and presented me to the Maharaja. He asked me who I was, and by what adventure I had come into his dominions. After I had satisfied him, he told me he was much concerned for my misfortune, and at the same time ordered that I should want nothing, which commands his officers were so generous as to see exactly fulfilled. Being a merchant, I frequented men of my own profession, and particularly inquired for those who were strangers, that perchance I might hear news from Baghdad, or find an opportunity to return. They put 1,000 questions respecting my country, and I, being willing to inform myself as to their laws and customs, asked them concerning everything which I thought worth knowing. There belongs to this king an island named Cassel. They assured me that every night a noise of drums was heard there, whence the mariners fancied that it was the residence of Degial. I determined to visit this wonderful place, and in my way thither saw fishes of 100 and 200 cubits long. That occasioned more fear than hurt, for they are so timorous that they will fly upon the rattling of 2 sticks or boards. I saw likewise other fish about a cubit in length that had heads like owls. As I was 1 day at the port after my return, a ship arrived, and as soon as she cast anchor, they began to unload her, and the merchants on board ordered their goods to be carried into the custom house. As I cast my eye upon some bales and looked to the name, I found my own, and perceived the bales to be the same that I had embarked at Bussorah. I also knew the captain, but being persuaded that he believed me to be drowned, I went and asked him whose bales these were. He replied that they belonged to a merchant of Baghdad called Sinbad, who came to sea with him, but had unfortunately perished on the voyage, and that he had resolved to trade with the bales until he met with some of his family, to whom he might return the profit. "I am that Sinbad," said I, "whom you thought to be dead, and those bales are mine." When the captain heard me speak thus, "Heavens!" he exclaimed, "whom can we trust in these times? There is no faith left among men. I saw Sinbad perish with my own eyes, as did all the passengers on board, and yet you tell me that you are Sinbad? What impudence is this? You tell a horrible falsehood in order to possess yourself of what does not belong to you." A what? Sorry? A what? Oh yeah. So maybe you weren't here before this part. So Sinbad was traveling with a bunch of other sailors, and they saw an island that looked really nice and peaceful, and they disembarked off the boat just to, meander upon that island. But apparently that island was at the back of a sea creature, a big sea monster, and everybody on the boats, thought that Sinbad died on that part of the travel. Okay? Right. "Have patience," replied I. "Do me the favor to hear what I have to say." Then I told him that I had escaped, and by what adventure I met with the grooms of the Maharaja, who had brought me to this court. The captain was at length persuaded that I was no cheat, for there came people from his ship who knew me and expressed much joy at seeing me alive. Bales. He picked up bales. Bales it's an old saying of, it's an old word for luggage, So that's why they said bales. Okay? No worries. Keep on asking questions. If you have any questions, I will answer them. We're here to learn together, you know? Alright. So, the captain was at length persuaded that I was no cheat, for there came people from his ship who knew me and expressed much joy at seeing me alive. At last, he recollected me himself, and embracing me, "Heaven be praised," said he, "for your happy escape. I cannot express the joy that it affords me. There are your goods. Take and do with them as you please." I thanked him, acknowledged his probity, and offered him part of my goods as a present, which he generously refused. I took out what was most valuable in my bales and presented them to the Maharaja, who, knowing my misfortune, asked me how I came upon by such rarities. I acquainted him with the circumstance of my recovery. He was pleased at my good luck, accepted my present, and in return gave me one much more considerable. Upon this, I took leave of him and went aboard the same ship. After I had exchanged my goods for the commodities of that country, I carried with me wood of aloes, sandal, camphire, nutmegs, cloves, pepper, and ginger. We passed by several islands, and at last arrived at Bussorah, from whence I came to this city with the value of 100,000 sequins. My family and I received one another with sincere affection. I bought slaves and a landed estate, and built a magnificent house. Thus I settled myself, resolving to forget the miseries I had suffered, and to enjoy the pleasures of life. Sinbad stopped here and ordered the musicians to proceed with their concert, which the story had interrupted. The company continued enjoying themselves till the evening, when Sinbad sent for a purse of 100 sequins, and giving it to the porter, said, "Take this, Sinbad, return to your home, and come back tomorrow to hear more of my adventures." The porter went away, astonished at the honor done, and the present made to him. The account of this adventure proved very agreeable to his wife and children, who did not fail to return thanks to God for what Providence had sent them by the hand of Sinbad. Water break. Sinbad put on his best apparel the next day, and returned to the bountiful traveler, who welcomed him heartily. When all the guests had arrived, dinner was served. When it was ended, Sinbad addressed himself to the company and said, "Gentlemen, be pleased to listen to the adventures of my second voyage. They deserve your attention even more than those of the first." Upon this, everyone held his peace, and Sinbad proceeded. "Oh, thank you, Yuzix. I know, I'm loving the story too. Ooh, seems like a big adventure, right? The second voyage is starting." The second voyage. I decided, after my first voyage, to spend the rest of my days at Baghdad, but it was not long ere I grew weary of an indolent life. My inclination to trade revived. I bought goods proper for the commerce I intended, and put to sea a second time with merchants of known probity. We embarked on board a good ship, and after recommending ourselves to God, set sail. We traded from island to island, and exchanged commodities with great profit. One day we landed on an island covered with several sorts of fruit trees, but we could see neither man nor animal. We went to take a little fresh air in the meadows, along the streams that watered them, whilst some diverted themselves with gathering flowers and other fruits. I took my wine and provisions, and sat down near a stream betwixt two high trees, which formed a thick shade. I made a good meal, and afterward fell asleep. I cannot tell how long I slept, but when I awoke, the ship was gone. I got up and looked around me, but could not see one of the merchants who landed with me. I perceived the ship under sail, but at such distance that I lost sight of her in such a short time. In this sad condition I was ready to die with grief. I cried out in agony and threw myself upon the ground, where I lay some time in despair. I upbraided myself 100 times for not being content with the produce of my first voyage. That might have sufficed me all my life. But all this was in vain, and my repentance came too late. At last I resigned myself to the will of God. Not knowing what to do, I climbed up to the top of a lofty tree, from whence I looked about on all sides to see if I could discover anything that could give me hopes. When I gazed toward the sea, I could see nothing but sky and water, but looking over the land I beheld something white, and coming down, I took what provision I had left and went toward it, the distance being so great that I could not distinguish what it was. As I approached, I thought it had to be a white dome of a prodigious height and extent, but when I came up to it, I touched it and found it to be very smooth. I went round to see if it was open on any side, but saw that it was not, and that there was no climbing up to the top, as it was so smooth. It was at least 50 paces round. By this time the sun was about to set, and all of a sudden the sky became as dark as it had been covered with a thick cloud. I was much astonished at this sudden darkness, but much more when I found it occasioned by a bird of a monstrous size that came flying toward me. I remembered that I had often heard mariners speak of a miraculous bird called the roc, and conceived that the great dome which I so much admired must be its egg. As I perceived the roc coming, I crept close to the egg, so that I had before me one of the bird's legs, which was as big as the trunk of a tree. I tied myself strongly to it with my turban, and in hopes that next morning she would carry me out with her out of this desert island. After having passed the night in this condition, the bird flew away as soon as it was daylight, and carried me so high that I could not discern the earth. She afterward descended with so much rapidity She afterward descended with so much rapidity that I lost my senses, but when I found myself on the ground, I speedily untied the knot, and I had scarcely done so when the roc had taken up a serpent of a monstrous length in her bill, and flew away. The spot where she left me was encompassed on all sides by mountains that seemed to reach above the clouds, and so steep that there was no possibility of getting out of the valley. This was a new perplexity, so that when I compared this place with the desert island from which the roc had brought me, I found that I gained nothing by the change. As I walked through this valley, I perceived that it was strewed with diamonds, some of which were of a surprising bigness. I took pleasure in looking upon them, but shortly saw at a distance such objects as greatly diminished my satisfaction, namely, a great number of serpents, so monstrous that at least some of them were capable of swallowing an elephant. They retired in the daytime to their dens, where they hid themselves from the roc, their enemy, and came out only in the night. I spent the day in walking about in the valley, resting myself at times in such places as I thought most convenient. When night came on, I went into a cave where I thought I might repose in safety. I secured the entrance with a great stone to preserve me from the serpents, but not so far as to exclude the light. I supped on part of my provisions, but the serpents, which began hissing around me, put me into such extreme fear that I could not sleep. When day appeared, the serpents retired, and I came out of the cave trembling. I can justly say that I walked upon diamonds without feeling any inclination to touch them. At last I sat down, and notwithstanding my apprehensions, not having closed my eyes during the night, fell asleep, after having eaten a little more of my provision. But I had scarcely shut my eyes when something that fell by me with a great noise awaked me. There was a large piece of raw meat, and at the same time I saw several others fall down from the rocks in different places. I had always regarded as fabulous what I had heard sailors and others relate of their valley of diamonds, and of the stratagems employed by merchants to obtain jewels from thence. But now I found that they had stated nothing but truth. For the fact is that the merchants come to the neighborhood of this valley when the eagles have young ones, and throw in great joints of meat into the valley. The diamonds upon whose points they fall stick to them. The eagles, which are stronger in this country than anywhere else, pounce with great force upon these pieces of meat, and carry them to their nests on the rocks to feed their young. The merchants at this time run to the nests, drive off the eagles by their shouts, and take away the diamonds that stick to the meat. Until I perceived the device, I had concluded it to be impossible for me to leave this abyss, which I regarded as my grave. But now I changed my opinion, and began to think upon the means of my deliverance. I began to collect the largest diamonds I could find, and put them in the leather bag in which I used to carry my provisions. I afterward took the largest pieces of the meat, and tied it close around me with the cloth of my turban, and then laid myself upon the ground with my face downward, the bag of diamonds being made fast to my girdle. I had scarcely placed myself in this posture when the eagles came. Each of them seized a piece of meat, and one of the strongest having taken me up with a piece of meat to which I was fastened, carried me to his nest on top of the mountain. The merchants immediately began their shouting to frighten the eagles, and when they had obliged them to quit their prey, one of them came to the nest where I was. He was much alarmed when he saw me, but recovering himself, instead of inquiring how I came thither, began to quarrel with me and asked why I stole his goods. "You will treat me," replied I, "with more civility when you know me better. Do not be uneasy, I have diamonds enough for you and myself, more than all the other merchants together. Whatever they have, they owe to chance. But I selected for myself in the bottom of the valley those which you see in this bag." I had scarcely done speaking when the other merchants came crowding about us, much astonished to see me, but they were much more surprised when I told them my story. They conducted me to their encampment, and there having opened my bag, they were surprised at the largess of my diamonds, and confessed that in all the courts which they had visited they had never seen any of this size and perfection. I prayed the merchant who owned the nest to which I had been carried, for every merchant had his own, to take as many for his share as he pleased. He contented himself with one, and that the least of them, and when I pressed him to take more, "No," he said, "I am very well satisfied with this, which is valuable enough to save me the trouble of making any more voyages, and will raise as great fortune as I desire." I spent the night with the merchants, to whom I related my story a second time, for the satisfaction of those who had not heard it. I could not moderate my joy when I found myself delivered from the danger I have mentioned. I thought myself in a dream, and could scarcely believe myself out of danger. The merchants had thrown their pieces of meat into the valley for several days, and each of them being satisfied with the diamonds that had fallen to his lot, we left the place the next morning and travelled near high mountains, where there were serpents of a prodigious length, which we had the good fortune to escape. We took shipping at the first port we reached, and touched at the Isle of Roha, where the trees grow that yield camphire, The tree is so large and its branches so thick that 100 men may easily sit under its shade. The juice of which the campfire is made exudes from a hole bored in the upper part of the tree, is received in a vessel where it thickens to consistency and becomes what we call campfire. After the juice is thus drawn out, the tree withers and dies. In this island is also found the rhinoceros, an animal less than an elephant but larger than a buffalo. It has a horn upon its nose, about a cubit in length. This horn is solid and cleft through the middle. I'm sorry, water break. Good. Remember to hydrate yourselves, guys. The rhinoceros fights with the elephant, runs his horn into his belly, and carried him off upon his head. But the blood and the fat of the elephant running into his eyes and making him blind, he falls to the ground, and then, strange to relate, the roc comes and carries them both away in her claws for food for her young ones. In this island I exchanged some of the diamonds for merchandise. From hence we went to other ports, and at last, having touched at several trading towns of the continent, we landed at Bussorah, from whence I proceeded to Baghdad. There I immediately gave large presents to the poor, and lived honorably upon the vast riches I had gained with so much fatigue. Thus Sinbad ended his relation, gave Hindbad another 100 sequins, and invited him to come the next day to hear the account of the third voyage. That was the second story, guys. I hope you're enjoying it. I really liked how, there were big serpents and the big rock. Whoa, that was really cool. And the huge diamonds that, it was so fantastical. Alright, water break, and then we continue with the third voyage. Okay, the third voyage. I soon lost the remembrance of the perils I had encountered in my 2 former voyages, said Sinbad, and being the flower of my age, I grew weary of living without business, and went from Baghdad to Bussorah with the richest commodities of the country. There I embarked again with some merchants. We made a long voyage, and touched at several ports, where we carried on a considerable trade. One day, being out in the main ocean, we were overtaken by a dreadful tempest, which drove us from our course. The tempest continued several days, and brought us before the port of an island, which a captain was very unwilling to enter, but we were obliged to cast anchor. When we had furled our sails, the captain told us that this and some other neighboring islands were inhabited by hairy savages who could speedily attack us. And though they were but dwarves, yes, we must make no resistance, for they were more in number than the locusts, and if we had happened to kill one of them, they would all fall upon us and destroy us. We soon found that what he had told us was but too true. An innumerable multitude of frightful savages, about 2 feet high, covered all over with red hair, came swimming towards us and encompassed our ship. They spoke to us as they came near, but we understood not their language, and they climbed upon the sides of the ship with such agility as surprised us. They took down our sails, cut the cables, and hauling to the shore, made us all get out, and afterward carried the ship into another island from whence they had come. We went forward into the island, where we gathered some fruits and herbs to prolong our lives as long as we could, but we expected nothing but death. As we advanced, we perceived at a distance a vast pile of buildings, and made toward it. We found it to be a palace, elegantly built, and very lofty, with a gate of ebony, which we forced open. We entered the court where we saw before us a large apartment with a porch, having on one side a heap of human bones, on the other a vast number of roasting spits. We trembled at this spectacle, and being fatigued with travelling, fell to the ground, seized with deadly apprehension, and lay a long time motionless. The sun set, the gate of the apartment opened with a loud thud, and there came out the horrible figure of a black man, and tall as a lofty palm tree. He had but one eye, and that in the middle of the forehead, where it looked as red as a burning coal. His foreteeth were very long and sharp, and stood out of his mouth, which was deep as that of a horse. His upper lip hung down upon his breast, his ears resembled those of an elephant and covered his shoulders, and his nails were as long and crooked as the talons of the greatest birds. At the sight of so frightful a giant we became insensible, and lay there like dead men. At last we came to ourselves, and saw him sitting in the porch looking at us. When he had considered us well, he advanced towards us, and laying his hand upon me, took me up by the nape of my neck, and turned me round as a butcher would do a sheep's head. After having examined me, and perceiving me to be so lean that I had nothing but skin and bone, he let me go. He took up all the rest one by one, and viewed them in the same manner. The captain being the fattest, he held him with one hand, as I would do a sparrow, and thrust a spit through him. He then kindled a great fire,